And hello, everybody. Welcome along. It is another edition of the Cricket Badger podcast, coming thick and fast at the moment. And this is one I've been looking forward to doing. Unfortunately, I had to delay Stephen last week, but we're on this today. And it is a pleasure to invite Stephen Chalke onto the Cricket Badger podcast to talk about something I think is quite special in the world of cricket. When I was working at Yorkshire Cricket, he used to pop into our offices and quite a character. And also one hell of a player, and also one hell of a story to write about. So the first question often, Stephen, when we talk about people's subject matter for books is, why on earth would you pick that person? Not necessarily in that phraseology, but I think that's a pretty easy question to answer, because Brian Close brings you quite a lot of subject matter. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen Chalke.
Thank you, James. Yes, indeed. Brian Close, I've been writing about cricket for nearly 30 years, mostly interviewing old players, many of them of the 1950s and 1960s. And throughout that time, Brian Close has been the character above all others who's fascinated me, and about whom there are more stories and people talk with more amusement, affection, admiration about him than any other cricketer of that era. So it's always been at the back of my mind that I wanted to write a book about him. And there was another biography of him 20 or so years ago by Alan Hill, and I thought, well, that's sort of crowded the marketplace out for it. But I still had this yen to write the book I wanted to write. And I had to give a talk back in the spring this year at Lord's on West Country cricket writers. And in the course of that, I was talking about Alan Gibson, who is in many ways my favourite cricket writer, a Yorkshireman who finished up down in the West Country. And he was present on the occasion in spring 1976 when Brian Close got runs against the touring West Indians and finished up going back into the England side at the age of 45. Having first played for England at 18, and it was an extraordinary career in which he was in and out of the team throughout. And I read this passage, beautiful passage, I won't read all of it, by Alan Gibson, and I put one small part of it on the back cover of the book, and it reads, "What the very dickens and the devil of a cricketer Close ought to have been for England. The historians in the future will be puzzled about it all. Was it his own fault? Very possible, though others might also be to blame." And I think that's the crux of the book in a way. Whose fault was it that he didn't achieve what he could have done in cricket? Trevor Bailey said when he saw him first at the age of 18, playing for Yorkshire against Essex, that he was the best teenage cricketer he'd ever seen. And he held that view right up until 1990 when he saw Sachin Tendulkar.
Right.
And Doug Insall, who was chairman of selectors throughout that period, in Brian Close's obituary in Wisden, he said he thought his career was the most disappointing of anybody of that era. He had so much talent that he didn't fulfill. So that's part of the question. Anyway, I read this extract at Lord's, and I was with my wife, Sue, and we were driving back down the M4 back to Bristol. And in the car, I said, "It's no good. I don't want to lie on my deathbed regretting that I never had a go about writing this book about Brian Close." And so that's how I immediately thought, right, I'm going to do it now. And I had all the interviews. I'd spoken to people for some. I mean, I've got an acknowledgements list at the back of the book of 50 or 60 people, and the majority of them have been dead for quite some while. And so I'm drawing on interviews with people who spoke to me years ago, contemporaries going right back into 1949 and through the 50s. And the story of Brian Close is so much more complex than this image that he has in later years of being this tough old boot who stands up to fast bowling and takes the bruises and never gives quarter to anybody. In the 1950s, he had a bit of a reputation in the Yorkshire team of being a hypochondriac, always on the masseur's table. And that's an aspect of it. And he was thought to be a great captain of England, of Yorkshire, of Somerset. And yet Yorkshire, Brian Sellers, the chairman of cricket, was incredibly reluctant to appoint him as captain, thought it would be a disaster, and really only appointed him in the end because he didn't have a better option. And so in this image of Brian Close as somebody who was suspected of hypochondria, who would have made a terrible captain because he was an unreliable maverick, it undermines the story that he was this really tough character who took all the blows and stood up straight throughout them. So that's the clock there going, 10 o'clock. It's an RSPB clock, and that's the sound of the nightingale for 10 o'clock. And so that's why I came to write the book.
Your book, One Hell of a Life, Brian Close, Daring, Defiant and Daft. The 3Ds, basically, for Closey. I mean, he used to, as I say, used to come into our offices at Headingley. And when we were in the old East Stands, we used to have offices in there, and the car park was just outside. And he'd park up, and he'd say, "Oh, Closey's here," and it wouldn't be for about 45 minutes before he'd actually come in, because he'd sit in his car, you'd see plumes of smoke coming out of every window. He'd have the racing post on his steering wheel, and he'd be putting his bets on and getting himself organised for the day. And then he'd come in and have a cup of tea with people. And I used to find it fascinating, Stephen. As somebody that loves cricket, I used to talk to him, and he'd remember the minutiae of games from years and years ago, long before I was born. At 3:45, I put short leg in, and we did this, that, and the other. And I mean, I don't know how accurate it was, I have to say, but he would seemingly remember absolutely everything about every game he played.
Yes, and he was always right, whatever he did. Yes, first of all, you've hit on the two great things in his life, the cigarettes and the horses. And in many ways, they led to him finishing his life in relative poverty. The amount of money I had an email from Mike Brearley. I described Brian Close's laugh as rasping, and he said, "I don't remember it being rasping. I remember it being a rather light laugh." And I said, "Yes, but you're talking about 500,000 cigarettes before what I'm talking about." Yeah. He was still smoking 40 a day when he was on radiotherapy for lung cancer. He just wouldn't stop, and of course he wouldn't stop with the horses either. And so in some ways there was a slight sadness in the way that he just, that's the daftness in a way. You know, he always dreamt he was going to win big on the horses, and it's a mug's game really. And as time went on, he didn't have the contacts in the racing business that he had when he was younger, so he was betting slightly more blind than he'd been earlier. But yes, he did have a good memory. I did a 90-minute interview with him in a filmed interview, a project that Yorkshire County Cricket Club set up in about 2000.
Was that was a series of 6 or 8, wasn't it? Of old
no, there
players.
Were two sets of six. And
yes,
I finished interviewing most of the players of that era on film, and it was all the film was provided by the filming by Leeds Met University, and they
many have since died, haven't they? And that was the point of doing it at that stage, wasn't it, to try and get them on film before they left us?
Yes, and you know, I know Vic Wilson's family were delighted that had been captured, and Brian was the first one I did. He was the first one to come in, and he was in quite an emotional mood that day, which I think he was an emotional man anyway. And we had a lunch celebrating the centenary of George Hurst's 2,000 runs and 200 wickets in a season. Astonishing achievement. And I'd written a little monograph on George Hurst's summer of 1906. So this would have been 2006. And I had to give a short speech at the lunch, and I read out George Hurst's final words from this balcony at Scarborough on the occasion of his last match. And we went up in the lift together, Brian and I, and Brian said, "Did he really say that?" And I said, "Yeah, I think he did." He said, "Well, there was a tear in my eye, lad, when you were reading it." And he was in that mood from the start. And there was a point when he was talking about his being sacked as Yorkshire captain where he just broke down in tears, and we had to stop the interview. And a slightly curious interview. If you ever get hold of a copy of it, because I think Yorkshire did have them for sale at one point, because he was the first, they had this idea that they didn't want me on the film at all, and that they wanted it just to be a monologue by Brian. So I was to keep my questions as brief as possible, and they would edit them out. Well, this didn't really work, because in the nature of it, there's bound to be a little bit back and forth in the conversation. So after we'd done it, they said, no, that doesn't work. Next time we meet, we'll film you asking the questions, and then we'll thread those in, and we'll repeat the question to you, the audio recording, and then you can ask it again. So if you ever buy that film, you'll find Brian Close sitting in the pavilion at Headingley answering questions from Stephen Chalke sitting in the pavilion at Scarborough.
Yeah, we did that series of DVDs, I think they were, weren't they? And
yes, they were. Yes.
And then so I can remember two things in sort of tribute to Closey. There was that, obviously, the interview you did with him on the DVDs, and then we did a dinner where in honour of Closey, I think Michael Holding attended and a few other people attended, because obviously we'll come on to Michael Holding and that over it later. But the and I don't know if I should say this or not. I'm going to say it because it's meant in affection. But his wife, it was to raise money for Closey. It's kind of a little bit of a kind of testimonial dinner, if you like. And his wife wanted the money to be paid to her, because if it went to Closey, it would go to the bookie. And that was that kind of goes together with what you said as well, that she was careful. So. Had to be careful with his money.
Yeah, I mean, they sold half the garden and then they downsized house. It was that serious. The gambling really got a grip of him. I think some of his ashes were actually scattered outside the bookies at Guiseley on the basis he spent most of his last years there, you know. But yes, that was that interview I did for 90 minutes is the longest conversation. I had several conversations with him, but that's the longest and most coherent one. And going back to your point, it did strike me when he talked through his career that he had the dates of his test matches absolutely spot on. He could go through it all with tremendous accuracy. He was a very gifted mathematician at school. His headmaster wanted him to go to Cambridge University to study maths. He's a grammar school boy. He thought he was good enough to win a scholarship to Cambridge as a mathematician. He also harbored a desire to study medicine at Leeds. So he was a very bright bloke in a lot of ways, but not in every way. And I've got a quote. One of the first quotes I ever got was from a Somerset cricketer, Ken Biddulph, talking about Brian Closey. He said, a funny chap, Closey. He was a brilliant genius and thick at the same time. And it's that combination that's so intriguing about him, that, you know, he sort of got slight tunnel vision. Part of the problem is he's never wrong. He can never admit fault. So, I mean, I said it on one occasion to somebody, I said, if just once in his whole cricket career he had sat down and thought to himself, when something went wrong, was there something I did that contributed to it going wrong, rather than blaming everybody else? And, you know, the excuses he came up with when he got out, they gave me the wrong flavor of chewing gum and things like this. You know? So that's part of the fun of him in a way. But the other thing about him, which everybody said, was that he had no malice whatsoever. He didn't hold grudges against people, and everybody was affectionate about him in a kind of way that's unusual for somebody of that character. He had that soft side to him. Ken Taylor's, I did a whole chapter of Ken Taylor's reminiscences. Ken Taylor, his teammate, and he finished up by saying there was a sort of childish innocence about him. He couldn't be nasty if he tried.
And yet, that's not a bad epitaph, really, is it? In a way, I mean, it was that. The weird, hard as nails. I mean, we used to say if there was a nuclear war, there'd be only two things left: cockroaches and Brian Close. And he was known to be the hard man of cricket, wasn't he? There's legendary stories of the ball hitting him on the head and bouncing off to be caught, and the pictures of him bruised all over the place after facing fast bowling. And yet, as you mentioned in the book, also very, very soft and very emotional and very, you know, there is that kind of paradox within him in pretty much every kind of aspect of human traits. He was one end and the other at the same time.
Yes, I think he didn't like to, you know, he said physical pain was easy to bear. It was some sentimentality that weakened you, you know? So he tried not to admit that, but it was there unquestionably, and he pushed everything to the limit. I mean, that's the daring side of him. And right from school days, Brian Stott went to the same school as him, and a year or two younger, joined the Yorkshire team some years after Brian. And he says, he was always up for a dare, up for a challenge. If anybody said, I bet you can't do this, he'd be straight away trying to do it. And of course, one of the events that really set him back the beginning of his career was a very strange one. And it's interesting to reflect on it now, given that England are now blooding cricketers into the test team with very, very little experience. But of course, they're handling them with a lot of sensitivity, and sensitivity of handling wasn't quite how people did things back in the day. So Brian Close should have gone into national service in February 49, but he was playing, he picked up a little small injury playing football, I think, and they deferred it, saying, well, leave it a short while and we'll call you back soon. But they didn't get round to calling him back. That would have been about February, on his 18th birthday, 49. Anyway, by May, he'd somehow come into the reckoning for Yorkshire, and they send him down to play the pre-season matches at Cambridge and then Oxford. And he did quite well in them and finished up staying in the team. And he did extremely well as an off-spin bowler mainly, and middle order batsman. More of a bowler than a batsman, actually, at that stage. And within a couple of months, he's got 600 runs and 60 wickets, and he's in line for the double. And England in that period, just after the war, they're looking for youth. They've lost 6 years. A lot of people who should have come through haven't come through. And there's quite a yearning for the next generation of cricketers. And lo and behold, Brian's playing for England at Old Trafford in 49 at the age of just 18. Youngest person ever to play for England until quite recently, Rian Ahmed made his debut. And so he didn't have a lot of success in the game, but he finished up the season doing the doubles, that youngest person ever to do the double, 1,000 runs and 100 wickets, youngest person ever to win a Yorkshire cap. And so he'd made this glorious start. And he was a lad from grammar school who'd grown up in a council house. And, the world that he entered was completely new to him. And these letters survive. David Warner, the Bradford and Telegraph Argus cricket correspondent, put them together in a book a couple of years ago. And they're beautiful letters, beautifully written, in which he's writing to his friend back home about all his experiences. And he keeps these letters going for about 7 years until they both have telephones. And his writing's very, very good. And, don't underestimate him as a very intelligent man. Anyway, he gets called up for national service, which is 18 months, which means he hardly plays in 1950. So he's had this golden summer in 1949. He's not playing in 50. He's a very immature young man. He's still learning the ways of cricket. And they go and select him to go to Australia that winter. Freddie Brown, the England captain, has got this idea that he wants to take a young team. And he leaves behind all these experienced players and takes a team full of youngsters with very little experience. And Yorkshire, to their credit, said to the selectors, don't select him, he's not ready. But they pursued it, and off he went to Australia, and he had a disastrous tour. And the older players really ostracized him. And it sort of starts on the boat going out, and he's not been playing. They're all tired after a summer's cricket. He's been pootling around in the army doing not very much, and he's full of beans, so he's in the swimming pool diving in off heights, and he gets told, he jumps over a chair to dive into the pool, and Freddie Brown tells him to cut it out, it's dangerous, but he doesn't take any notice, and immediately he's getting a reputation as being a bumptious, awkward character who needs cutting down to size a bit. Anyway, he gets picked for the second test. He goes out in the last over before lunch when they're a little bit of bother. And he third ball he faces, he plays a sweep shot, which is pretty awful, and gets caught. And he comes back into utter silence in the dressing room. And of course, he's in a terrible frame of mind, having played the shot and got out for naught at a crucial point. And Ian Johnson, the Australian, says to Freddie Brown, go in and have a word with young Close. He's looking very sorry for himself. And he said, "Oh, let the blighter stew." And things went from bad to worse on that tour. And he was very, very lonely. In one of the letters, he tries not to let on to his friend in the letters, but in one letter he intimates that he's had suicidal thoughts. And he comes home a bit before the end of the tour because he doesn't go on to the New Zealand bit. And I think that stayed with him all his life, the pain of that 6 months of being ostracized by people like Dennis Compton, Reg Simpson, people who've been his heroes. And he took that hurt to his grave. There's no question of that. And it, I think, informed his own captaincy later. I think, some of the things that happened to him when he was young, I think it gave him an understanding of life, which in a certain sort of way made him a particularly good captain. And so that early part, when he plays at such a young age for England. So the book starts, chapter 1, too old, and the controversy of him being brought back for England at the age of 45. And then the next thing, it's too young.
Yeah.
And there's the controversy of him being picked for Australia when he's only 18. And in both cases, there was quite a lot of dissent from the decision to pick him. So, and there's so many ups and downs in the years in between. Notably, of course, the fact that he's made England captain is an absolutely outstanding success. And he's then sacked because the forces at Lords were very uneasy about the prospect of him leading the MCC team in the West Indies, where on one or two previous tours there have been diplomatic episodes, and they wanted the right sort of chap to be the ambassador for the MCC out in the Caribbean, and they didn't see a single-minded Yorkshireman who never omitted fault as being, they weren't comfortable with him. And the manoeuvring that went on I think that's the pivotal chapter of the book, actually.
I'll tell you what, we'll come into that in a bit more detail after we just take a very short break to say thank you very much to the sponsors of the Cricket Badger podcast, manscaped.com. So here's a little advert for them. And off the back of that, we'll be back with Stephen Chalke to talk all things Brian Close.
If men were squares, shaving would be easy because a flat surface is perfect for a traditional razor. But we're not squares.
What?
Presenting Manscaped's new Dome Shaver Pro. Because we're not flat, we have curves, we have balls, we have round. Where most blades are created for flat surfaces, the Dome Shaver Pro is designed specifically for your big round head. With 5 double-track skin-safe blade heads and Manscaped's Flex Adjust technology, you'll be able to shave your head faster and more efficiently than ever before without the fear of nicks or cuts. And yes, of course it's waterproof. This is Manscaped. So go ahead and enjoy that big, bold beauty. Embrace the spherical essence of your existence. Grab life by the bald. Shop now at manscaped.com.
Indeed, shop now at manscaped.com. Thank you to them for their support of the Cricket Badger podcast. And for now, if you quote, it said 20% on that advert. If you quote Badger now, you will get yourself 25% off during this festive period. Not too late to get a little stocking filler for somebody in your life, friends and family. Anyway, with Stephen Chalke, talking about all things Brian Close. He's got a book out, One Hell of a Life, Brian Close, Daring, Defiant and Daft. And that's a great title. And also, Stephen, I have to say, you're a great guest. I asked you a question. I can sit back for 10 minutes. You're a fantastic speaker. Really good to have you on. Let's talk about Brian Close and those bruises and that over from Michael Holding, which was what actually you mentioned the dinner before. That was one of the centerpieces of that dinner, talking through that over, because that was one hell of a summer for English cricket. They were lurching to try and find an answer to get rid of the West Indian pace battery, which was bombarding them with short pitch bowling, etc., and turned to Brian at the age of 45, which seems in retrospect to be a really weird choice, doesn't it? But Brian Close is kind of legendary almost. If you ask most people to think about things that Brian Close did, that over would be probably most people's number one answer, wouldn't it? Michael Holding whispering in.
It wasn't just one over, but first of all, the bruises. That wonderful picture of the bruises.
That was a different match, wasn't it?
That was Wes Hall in 1963. Wes Hall was the fastest bowler in the country in the world at the time, bowling from the pavilion end at Lord's, where there wasn't much of a sight screen, on a pitch that had a nasty little patch in it. And Brian Close decided the best way of dealing with some of the bowling was just to let it hit his chest. And then later in the innings, in order to disrupt Wes Hall, he started, it's on YouTube, you can watch it, he started coming down the wicket to him. Before Wes Hall's running into bowl, he's approaching the bowling crease, and Brian's got his bat up in the air and he's sort of taking 2 or 3 paces down the track to the fastest bowler in the world. And it's absolutely wonderful theatre. I mean, I was, 15 years old at the time, and that inning stayed with me like no other in my childhood. I thought it was and it was probably his finest hour as an England batsman. But they didn't win the match, of course. He managed to get out just before the end, and they finished up. Colin Cowdrey coming in with his arm in plaster, but terrific occasion. So and then you got the incident 2 years earlier where he has a slightly mad attempt to sweep Richie Benno out of the attack at Old Trafford, and everybody says he'll never play for England. Norman Yardley on air on Test Match Special, he should never play for England again, and absolutely pilloried for it. But then you're right, 1976 rolls round, and by this time he's down at Somerset, and he's now the big thing is that throughout the years at Yorkshire, when he's the captain, he's playing this sort of game to win championships, where he's not the key batsman. They've got Boycott in the team by the end, and the people at Somerset said to me, when we used to play Yorkshire, we used to think he was a bit of a slogger. And he didn't set his stall out to make a big score and have a fine average, as none of them did. Ken Taylor's got this wonderful story about Brian Close as captain taking Phil Sharp and Ken aside when they're going out to score some runs ahead of a second innings declaration and saying to them, I want 100 runs in 40 minutes. Don't get out and don't make it look easy. So none of them are going to finish up with good batting. Well, Boycott does, of course, because he plays his own way. But none of the others are going to finish up with a good batting average.
That was Close's version of Bazball, was it? Close.
Well, it was, I suppose. Yes, he was. There was quite a bit of Bazball about him in a kind of way, although he could play the other way as well. He wasn't quite as gung-ho with it. But then he goes down to Somerset after Yorkshire take the captaincy off him, and one of the reasons. The 3 reasons Yorkshire took the captaincy off him. One, that he had expressed a great dislike of one-day cricket at a time when across the Pennines, Lancashire were winning all these trophies in one-day game and attracting enormous crowds. And Yorkshire were looking across and thinking, well, we should be doing that. But they had a captain who just didn't like it. 2, that he wasn't promoting young players. He was too loyal to his old team. And there were a number of episodes where the committee asked him to pick people and he didn't pick them. And 3, they had a surgeon's report saying that they thought he had at most 1 more year of cricket in him, that his body was near its end. And then he goes down to Somerset and he just completely defies all those 3 things. He develops them into a good one-day team, almost win the Sunday League. He plays 7 more years. And of course, he's absolutely brilliant with their young players. And the mark he leaves on Ian Botham and Viv Richards, it lasts throughout their careers. And they will tell you that if ever you talk to them. So
both of those players absolutely love him, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, in different ways. He had a massive impact on both of them. And the relationship with Ian Botham's a particularly striking one, because Ian married the daughter of Brian and Vivian Close's best friends, and they used to go on holidays together. Yes, massive influence on both of them. So he's gone down to Somerset, and of course he's playing for a weak team, so he's batting up at number 3 and batting properly. And you look at his figures in those years at Somerset, he's averaging 40, 50 one year, 45, numbers he never averaged at Yorkshire. And Peter Robinson at Somerset said to me, only when he came down to us did we realise just how good a player he was. But he hadn't.
Was there an element there, Stephen, of that great Yorkshire side that he was part of, that won championship after championship, had so many good batters that he didn't necessarily need to score the runs, so he could maybe be a bit more carefree, whereas when he went to Somerset, he had to shoulder that responsibility?
Yes, well, that's definitely part of it. And also that they were playing to win the championship, and they were looking. He declared on the time he needed to bowl other teams out rather than on how many he needed to set them. And so, the batting did, at times, they did throw their wickets away in order to score quick runs. There's no question of that. And Ken Taylor said to me, we had terrible averages. And you could look at players at other counties, maybe Ken Barrington at Surrey or even Dennis Amiss at Warwickshire. And, they would just go out and bat to get a good score and get in the England team. But they couldn't do that at Yorkshire, not with Brian Close as captain. It wasn't the Yorkshire way. So, yes, undoubtedly, going down to Somerset, where he was effectively an overseas player. They'd never come across anybody the like of him before. He was bringing a culture to the setup which sleepy old Somerset had never had, given them a competitiveness that really set them up to become that great team they became just after he left. And so that's the context in which he gets pulled back into the England team. Now, he played that great innings that I described earlier against the West Indians. It wasn't 100, actually got 80 odd, I think. And at the same time as the England selectors were at a trial match at Bristol, looking at all their options for the first Test match. Tony Greig was now the captain, and all the batting had failed in the previous match, MCC versus West Indians at Lord's. So they were a bit desperate, and Tony Greig in his first match as England captain, the previous summer against the Australians, had forced the selectors to pick David Steele, who was a journeyman Northamptonshire batsman with white hair and spectacles, and seemed a most extraordinary selection. John Barclay says they were playing at Worcester, and Tony Greig, who was their captain, Sussex captain, came back to them, and he said that over lunch, he said, "I bet you can't guess. I want you each to write down who you think we've selected to play and not one of them could guess it. And of course, he was outstandingly successful and was the BBC Sports Personality of the Year, standing up to Lillian Thompson, two more great fast bowlers. So, of course, that sort of gave Brian Close the idea that there was merit in bringing back older players. And so he turns up at the selection meeting for the first Test against the West Indians, saying he wants Brian Close in the team. Now, there's 4 selectors and him, so it's a majority vote. Alec Bedser is the chairman, but Len Hutton, one of the selectors, is away on business, so there's only 4 of them there. So he manages to persuade Ken Barrington to support him. So 2 in favour, 2 against, and he's got the casting vote. So somehow or other, Tony Greig talks Brian Close into the England team. Alec Bedser is absolutely furious, went back to Lord's and had the system changed so that he had the casting vote. Len Hutton was appalled by the decision. But to be fair to him, Brian Close did rather well. He did okay in the first Test. At Lord's, he and David Steele were the 2 who scored most runs. He got over 100 runs in the 2 innings and did well at Lord's. And actually, even in that game, if you look at that game at Old Trafford, which we're coming on to, in the second innings, he and John Edrich, who opened the batting, they put on 50 or 60 for the first wicket, and they were all out for not much more than 100. So, this idea that he was a complete flop, anyway, they go out to bat for the second innings late on the Saturday. I think there's 80 minutes of play left. And Brian Close, age 45, and John Edrich, age 39. And Michael Holding bowls, I think it's 7 overs. Every ball which at Brian Close, John Edrich staying down the other end.
He knew what he was doing there, John Edrich, didn't he? We should mention as well, for people who are of slightly younger vintage, that this was all done without helmets and all. We see people getting hit on the head on a regular basis these days because I think the ability to play the short ball has diminished as a result of having that protection. But this was all done with a bare Brian Close head and the ball literally zipping millimeters from his nose.
Yes. Oh, yes. And hitting, he's having to get out of the way. One's up in the rib cage and everything. And I mean, it's quite a frightening period of play. The umpires got a lot of criticism for not telling the bowlers to pitch it up a bit more. But he took a full, I think it was 7 overs. It might have been 8. I can't remember. And he took every ball, or every one of them a maiden. And he just stood there. And on the YouTube clip, there's a couple of times when he gets hit where he judders, his knees slightly go, and then he pulls himself up. And at one point, Viv Richards, who's standing quite close by, fielding close by, asking, "Are you all right, Cappy?" And he tells him to clear off in very short terms. He's not going to admit that he's feeling pain, or he's absolutely. And I think the contrast between him and John Edrich is fascinating, because I think John Edrich apparently said 1 effing test too far. Whereas and looked like he didn't want to be there at all. Whereas Brian Close, I think he loved it. I think he absolutely loved that battle, and they came off after 80 minutes of this, and they looked up at the scorebook and John Edrich pointed out to him his score was 1 not out. He batted through all of that for 1 run, and he was.
Your title, Daring, Defiant and Daft, basically it encapsulates that as well, doesn't it? That little passage of play is basically incredibly brave, incredibly stubborn, but blimey, it was like facing a firing squad, because Michael Holding was swift, wasn't he?
He was swift. So Wes Hall and Michael Holding, but he loved those people. You see, he never. A lot of people complained about the tactics of Charlie Griffith, who was said to throw it in '63, and the short pitch bowling of Michael Holding at Old Trafford. Brian Close never complained about any of that. His view was he'd grown up in Yorkshire in the 30s, where life was hard and people played hard, but they played fair. And that's the cricket you've got to play if you're going to beat the Australians and the West Indians. And he was a great friend of Gary Sobers, also loved the horses, of course. And, he always got on. He played a lot of test matches against the West Indies. He only ever played twice against Australia, the one in his first tour when he got out for a duck, and the one against Richie Benno when he tried to sweep him and got slated for that as well. So, but he played a lot against the West Indies. He played against them in 57. He played against them in 63, all the series when he had that great innings at Lord's. He came back for the last test of 66 when England were a defeated, demoralised side, looking very sorry for themselves, and captained the team in the last test at the Oval and won by an innings, which I suppose was the highlight of his whole England career. He completely rejuvenated that team overnight, got the team he wanted, and gave them self-belief again. And then he came back in 76. So there's a sort of irony in the fact that the MCC types didn't want him captaining England in the West Indies, because I think he and the West Indians got on well. I think he played a cricket that they understood and admired, and he admired them. And they just weren't comfortable. I've written a whole chapter about the social background of that era, the kind of people running Lords, and the way in which England in the 60s was opening up into Northern culture more. And, the people emerging who were sort of folk heroes who paraded their northernness in a kind of way, which I won't say Brian Close did that, but there was certainly that north-south tension in that era. It's probably not quite as strong now, but it was very strong then. And of course, if you think about it, the 3 most successful England captains of the first 30 years after the Second World War are the only 3 people of real professional background, all Yorkshiremen. Len Hutton, Brian Close, Ray Illingworth. You
mentioned the fact that he only played twice against Australia. I sometimes cringe that we put so much store on the Ashes and not on other series. But it's obviously the iconic series between the two countries. And do you think that diminishes his legacy when people think about greats of the game? Maybe that is the fact that he didn't have a starring role in an Ashes series win is something which counts against Closey when people remember his cricket.
Yeah, he's not a great at the game, if you're honest. His record doesn't suggest that. He was a brilliant cricketer in many ways. He was an inspiring captain, and he was a fascinating character, but he didn't achieve all he could have done in the game. I think with a little bit more of Ray Illingworth's shrewdness, canniness, less. I think he lacked a little in, moderating his attacking tender. He was much better going forward as an attacking captain.
There's an element of Ben Stokes about this, isn't there? In terms of comparing him to Buzzball, that Ben Stokes is often a bit reckless and a bit, but I think has actually added quite a lot in his captaincy to this England team, and you can see the comparisons, can't you?
Yes, you can. I think Ben Stokes might be a better listener to other people than Brian Close was. I think he might be a more feely, touchy sort of character, putting his arm around people than Brian Close did. But Brian Close had, one of the things, one of the films I did in that series was a tribute to Fred Truman, who died. In fact, Fred Truman's death was actually the trigger for the whole series. People thinking, oh gosh, this chap's died and we haven't got his memories down on film for us. And Fred Truman stood in as captain of Yorkshire in 1968 for a few weeks when Brian Close was injured, and his famous victory was an innings victory over the Australian tourists who were virtually at full strength. And I think on occasion he would say that was his proudest moment in cricket. So I asked, and Brian Close and Fred Truman they made their debut in the same match in 1949, and they were within a few days the same age as each other, but they weren't really kindred spirits, and there was always this tension between the two of them which surfaced from time to time, which I've written about in the book. And I asked Brian he came in to talk about Fred Truman in this tribute film, and I asked him whether he thought Fred would like to have been captain of Yorkshire. And he said, I'm sure he would. And then he stopped. He said, I'd rather not answer that. And it did, he was angling to be the captain. And there was according to Fred, there was a serious possibility he might have been replaced Brian Close at one stage. And in fact, there's this curious episode during the summer of 1968 when Brian Close is out injured, when he comes into the dressing room and says, I'd like to remind you all that I'm still the captain of this team, So he's starting to feel rather insecure with Fred pushing him out. And I think Fred possibly saw his way of staying in the game a bit longer by becoming the captain. Anyway, so I said, but he did carry on eventually. Having said he'd rather not talk about this, he then said, to captain in one match is one thing, but to captain a team across a summer, you need to do 4 things, and you need to do them in the right order. First, you have to look after the game you're playing. Second, you have to look after the team. Third, you have to look after the individuals in the team. And last, you have to look after yourself. And he stopped before saying, which is obviously what he wanted to go on to say, I don't think Fred could have put them in that order. Yeah. And I don't think Geoffrey Boycott could put them in that order either. So it's the game, the team, the individuals of the team, and then finally the self. And funnily, I had an interview with Mike Brearley sometime after this, where I repeated this to Mike Brearley, and he seemed rather surprised that Brian had said that, as though he didn't think that Brian, as a captain, would conceptualize things as clearly as that. And yet Brian himself somewhere talks about lying awake at night, worrying about the team and things that have happened in games. And, many's the time I've got up at 3 o'clock in the morning to have a cup of tea to think things through in my mind, So, he took the burden of captaincy. It wasn't all water off a duck's back like he liked to pretend. He didn't, Jeff Cope said he never came back complaining about what had happened in the committee and the pressures he kept it all to himself. But it was there. The strain of it was all there. I mean, it's a great story about him ringing Tony Nicholson at about 2:00 in the morning to discuss something. He's lying in bed with Vivian, and anyway, he gets through to Tony Nicholson, and Tony Nicholson says, "Brian, do you know what time it is?" And apparently Brian turned to Vivian and said, "Vivian, Tony wants to know what the time is. You've got the clock on your side."
that four things of captaincy over a season. I've not heard that before. That's really perceptive and intuitive and quite deep thinking, isn't it? As you know,
Yes.
Again, the kind of paradox of somebody who is carefree but yet actually thinks and probably overthinks the game at the same time. He's a very interesting fella, Brian Close, isn't he? This isn't something that you should really say to a writer. I mean, I've written a few books, and if somebody said this to me, I'd probably cringe a bit. But the picture section is very good.
I don't mind you saying that.
You tend to thumb to the photographs, and the picture section I think is really good because there's a number in the picture section which stand out. I mean, obviously there's a lot of talk about Close's sporting ability, incredibly talented in other sports as well, including golf, which he could play single handicap both right and left-handed, which is incredible, isn't it? And but he seems to have been. I mean, the picture with him as when he's first selected, I always think, Stephen, when you look back at the kind of 1920s, 1930s, and they've all got the handlebar moustaches, and 19-year-olds look like they're 58, don't they? But but Brian looks quite old when he's first picked. But you can see the freshness in that face, can't you? Where when he's young and he's first picked, but he's quite photogenic, and because he does so much, there's quite a few good photographs of him, aren't there?
Yes, there are. There's a lovely photo of him garlanded, having won some brand snatch motor racing trophy, competed by fellow sportsmen. You know, of course, this was ideal for him because he loved racing his cars as fast as possible. And I think Richard Mead, the show jumper, came second. There's a lovely quote from Fred Truman saying he valued that more than any century he ever scored because he made it look like he was the fastest sportsman in the country. The truth was the rest of us was just keeping out of his way. So there's good humor in the book. I've done a whole chapter on his driving, and I've got a chapter later on where I put together some of the stories which they verge on the apocryphal in places, but I think there's a lot more truth to them. And these stories of the ball bouncing off his head and being caught by another fielder and so forth. I mean, it's pain. It's all he called his book "I Don't Bruise Easily."
Yes.
But he didn't want to call it that. And it's not a good title, actually, because I remember reading the book way back when it came out, however many, 1979 or something. And I thought, there's a bruise on every page of this book. He's in pain from so many things that went wrong in his career. He did bruise. It may not have been physical. What he wanted to call it.
Sorry, the picture next to that title as well shows him covered in bruises. It isn't the best title, is it?
Yes. And what he wanted to call it was "I Took the Blows," which, of course, is from Frank Sinatra. So I took the blows and did it my way. Round
off our chat, and honestly, I could talk to you for hours on Close. He's such an interesting fella. But in terms of "I Took the Blows" and in terms of doing it my way, do you think he finished his life contented with the way he tackled things, with any regrets, or do you think he was? How do you think he would have reviewed his contribution to cricket?
Well, I suppose the best thing is to give him the last word on that, which is, in fact, what I do at the end of the book, which is, when I got to the end of that filmed interview, I asked him to sum up, and he said, he talked about his love of the game. Every one of us enjoyed it, participating, competing, helping others, winning for your team, having some achievement at the end of it that you could share with other people. It was just a great lifetime experience. Notice the way he puts that. It's sharing it with other people, not just I got a lot of runs or, I took 3. Fred Truman could quote his averages, Boycott could as well, but I don't think Brian Close could quote his figures like that.
I've heard Sir Geoffrey put people right on his average. If you get the decimal point wrong, then you're in the firing line.
Well, Fred Truman would do that as well. You know, it's been a life full of enjoyment, I suppose, and a few sad moments. I've laughed at them many a time when I've shared my experiences with people. It's been one hell of a life. That's what he said. And I think that was how he dealt with it. He knew he'd had his cock-ups, but he found a way of living with them. And he still had the defiance right to the end, still smoking his 40 a day when he was told not to smoke, still going down the bookies. He couldn't be wrong. He carried on his own way through it all. And I don't think he saw the point in regret, really. No. He was more aware of the wrongs he'd been done and the misfortunes he'd had than he was the things he himself did wrong. He had a good marriage, and the story of how he came to marry Vivian, which is in the book, her account of that is hilarious and quite poignant, actually, and reveals that impulsive streak to him as well. The way, but you know, she kept him. She said, "I'm sure he would have gone under." Because he trusted people too much. She said, you know, I'd see people and I'd see they were up to no good, but he wouldn't see it, you know, and I had to hold him back from things, you know. Oh, God, there you go again. So there was that naivety, a childish innocence about him. Yeah. He couldn't be nasty if he tried. That's the endearing side of him. And and alongside that tough Yorkshireman, I took the blows, that combination is very special, actually. So no, he wasn't a great of the game, but he was in so many ways the most fascinating character of that era.
Last question, Stephen. If I could give you the choice of being a more straight-laced professional, never doing anything too wrong, averaging kind of like 45, and being the ultimate kind of cricketer, or being interesting like Closey and having the ups and downs and the slightly more intriguing and charismatic lifestyle, which one would you pick?
For myself, well, I'd be very tempted to pick the latter. I've got a streak of that in me, but I don't think I played my cricket like that. I wasn't good enough in a way.
Yeah. I think most of us would, though, wouldn't we? We'd all want to have the good average and have the respect of everybody. I mean, Closey's got the respect of everybody, but I think that the kind of almost like boy's own up and atom kind of lifestyle that Closey had, and prone to kind of like taking on the challenges and extremes and stuff like that. I think he's far more probably appealing to people in terms of how you might not want to do it all the way through your life, but you'd like to have a little taste of it, wouldn't you?
Yes. And of course, the person who has done that and lived his life much that way is Ian Botham.
Yeah. And and Closey was very much his mentor in that respect, wasn't he? So
he was.
Incredible man, Brian Close, and an incredible life. And it's, I mean, as you mentioned, there was that book before, but it's amazing more hasn't been written about Brian Close. And
I'll just say one more thing.
You filled that hole, Stephen, haven't you? You filled that hole.
I'll tell you. And one thing I haven't said, which I should have said, is I had a very, very long morning with Lynn, Brian Close's daughter. And I had a good conversation as well with Lance, his son, who's down in Kent. And hearing their version of their father, particularly in his later years, I think gave me quite a lot of feeling that I was getting things right. And they added quite a lot of colour to some of the later life. And I think Lynn's line late in the book it's the best line in the book. She says, "He wasn't a good dad, but he was mine."
That again, the yin and yang of Brian Close's life, isn't it? I mean, I haven't had a chance to read it all because I've been up half the night to watch the New Zealand tests over the last few weeks. But it is the bits I've read are really good, and I'm going to read the rest of it. I certainly am. So, one hell of a life, Brian Close, Daring, Defiant, and Daft, by my guest today, Stephen Chalke. It's been an absolute pleasure, Stephen, to catch up with you again and to listen to your take on Brian Close's life. Wish you a very Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and every success with the book.
Thank you. And the same to all your listeners. Have a good Christmas, and may Yorkshire have a good summer next year, because English cricket needs a good, strong Yorkshire.
Strong Yorkshire, strong England, etc. Exactly. So we will see how. Is it too late to order your book for Christmas? Do you think?
I hope not. I hope not. I think
you could probably still get it, couldn't you?
Yeah, bookshops all have a system where you can go in and ask for a book, and generally at normal times they can have the book by the next day. So I think you could do that. I won't mention.
You don't have to be a Yorkshireman, I don't think, to enjoy this book. Just a cricket fan, or sports fan, or just a fan of somebody that's an interesting human being, because that's what Brian Close was. Anyway, thank you, Stephen, again. Thank you, everybody, for watching and live, and thank you, everybody, for listening later. This may be, I'm not sure yet if we're going to come back for another one about India, Australia, but this may be the last podcast of 2024. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening all the way through the year, and for your comments as we've gone through. Always much appreciated. So if this is the last edition of the Cricket Badger podcast of the year, Happy New Year, everybody, and enjoy yourselves over the Christmas period, and we'll see you again in 2025. Cheers, everybody.